The day my father decided to give away his first car started like any other, but it felt wrong from the moment I opened my eyes. The sky over our small town was this washed-out gray that never quite turns into rain. It just hangs there, heavy, like the weather is tired too. I drank my coffee from the chipped mug with the old garage logo on it, leaning against the kitchen counter, staring out at the almost empty street. It was early autumn, that kind of morning when the air is cold but not cold enough to justify a heavy jacket. So you step outside feeling slightly uncomfortable, slightly undecided, exactly how I felt inside. My phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from my dad. "Come over today at 4. I want you both here. Important. Dad." No emojis, no explanation. He's never been good with written words, but I learned over time to read the silence between his lines. When he said important, it usually meant something had been crushing his chest for days. I took a breath, ran my hand through my hair, pulled back into a rushed bun, and looked around the tiny apartment I call home. Pile of dishes, a jacket thrown over the couch, a dying plant in the corner. Adult life has this weird way of always feeling temporary, like you're occupying a space on borrowed time, waiting for something you don't even know how to name. I left for work, driving my used car, the old sedan that squeaks a little when I make sharp turns. On the way to the office, I passed by my father's garage. The metal doors were half open, and through a gap, I could see his shadow moving inside, that slightly hunched, stubborn shape, like time had scraped his body, but not broken his will. The faded sign still said, "Mike's Garage," in letters that had once been red, but were now almost pink from the sun. That's where I grew up, running between tools, the smell of grease, and the murmur of customer conversations. When I stopped at the red light out front, I could almost smell the burnt oil and old rubber again, and for a moment, I wasn't stuck in morning traffic. I was 7 again, sitting on the tall wooden stool, swinging my legs while I watched my dad work on the navy blue car he called his first love. That car wasn't just a bunch of metal and bolts. It was his story. He always said it was with that car that he drove halfway across the country to get away from a job that was killing him slowly, that he slept in it more nights than he could count because he couldn't afford a motel, and that it was in that driver's seat that he decided he wanted to be a real father, present, not just someone the kids saw in old photos. I remember the way his hand moved across the hood, almost gently, like he was afraid to hurt it. I remember the sound of rain hitting the tin roof of the garage on some random afternoon while he told me, eyes shining, about the first time the engine turned over after almost a year dead. I listened like you listen to a fairy tale, eyes wide, soaking in every detail, as if I were memorizing the story for the day he wouldn't be there to repeat it. The light turned green, and the horns behind me yanked me out of the memory. I hit the gas a little too fast, my heart slightly tight. I knew that meeting at 4 had something to do with that car. I can't explain how, but I knew. Sometimes your body senses what's coming long before your mind can name it. Lately, my body had been feeling a lot of things I didn't know how to label. A lump in my throat when I thought about the future, a weight on my chest when I watched my dad walking more slowly, a mix of anger and guilt when I thought about my brother Daniel. Daniel. Just thinking his name makes my shoulders tense. He's always been the disappearing son. The one who shows up and disappears again, like family, is a train station where he only stops when he needs shelter or money. While I stayed, he left. While I sat in the office on weekdays and in the garage on weekends helping Dad, he was out there somewhere, chasing a life that looked like other people's lives on social media. It's not that he's a bad person, he's just absent. But somehow, in my father's mind, absence never canceled out love. At work, I could barely focus. The hours dragged on. My co-workers' voices sounded far away, like I was underwater and only catching echoes. On my break, I picked up my phone and opened the platform where I share stories. I started scrolling through comments from strangers who, ironically, seemed to understand me better than some relatives. Every story I read reminded me that nobody carries a blank heart. Everyone is covered in invisible bruises. And if you're listening to this now, maybe it's because, in some way, you recognize yourself in this strange place of being the one who stays when others leave. If that's you, stay with me, subscribe to the channel, because I have a feeling we'll still meet again in a lot of stories that look way too much like our own. At 3:30, I left the office early with some half-baked excuse. I drove in silence to the house where I grew up, that simple brick place with a front yard that's been neglected since my mom left. The sky was even heavier now, like it might finally burst, and the wind had that damp earth smell that always reminds me of Sundays when my dad would wash the blue car out front, singing old songs he swore no one respects anymore. When I parked, I noticed my brother's car already there, shiny, modern, expensive. The kind of car that looks good in restaurant photos with empty captions. He rarely shows up, but when he does, he always makes sure everyone notices. I took a deep breath before getting out of my car. The feeling that something was about to change was almost tangible, like the air before a storm, like the moment before a word you know you can't take back once it's spoken. I glanced one last time toward the garage next to the house, the door half open, a slice of yellow light breaking into the gray afternoon. The car was in there, the car that held not just my father's past, but mine. And that day, without me knowing it, it also held the beginning of a break I wouldn't be able to unsee afterward. When I opened the front door, the smell hit me first, a mix of freshly brewed coffee, old wood, and that cheap cologne my dad has used forever. Funny how smells store memories you didn't even know you kept. Suddenly, I was 12 again, walking in through that same door, throwing my backpack on the couch and complaining that none of my classmates understood why I always smelled like grease during the week. My dad, Michael, was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug in his hand. His hair, once dark, was now almost completely gray. There was something different about the way he held the mug, like it weighed more than it looked. He looked up at me and smiled, that crooked smile that always reveals more tiredness than joy, but that I would recognize anywhere in the world. "You came," he said, as if he had doubted it. "You texted important," I answered, hanging my bag on the chair. "I still remember what that means." He chuckled, a short laugh that died quickly. Daniel appeared shortly after, coming from the living room. He was wearing an expensive shirt, a shiny watch, his hair perfectly styled. He gave me one of those quick, polite hugs that fool no one. "Hey, Em," he said, using the nickname that only sounds real when it comes from Dad. "Long time." "Yeah," I replied, not trying to fill the silence. We sat at the table, the three of us, like we hadn't done in a long time. The old clock on the wall marked each second with an irritating tick-tock, as if time itself was impatient for us to start. My dad turned the mug in his hands, staring into the coffee like he was trying to find courage at the bottom. "So," he began, clearing his throat, "I called you here because, well, I thought it was time. Nothing good starts with, I thought it was time." My stomach tightened. I looked around. The same curtains my mother chose before she left, the same crooked picture of some generic sunset, the same scratches on the table where we used to push toy cars like it was a racetrack. Everything in that room seemed frozen in time, except us. "Time for what?" Daniel asked, straight to the point. My dad took a deep breath. "To put some things in order. You both know I'm not getting any younger. My health's been scaring me a little." He shrugged, but I saw fear flicker at the back of his eyes. "And I don't want to leave everything messy for you to deal with when I'm gone." The words, "when I'm gone," echoed inside me. He never talked about his own death. It was like admitting weakness was some kind of betrayal against everything he believed himself to be. "Dad," I started, but he raised his hand to stop me. "Let me talk, Em. If I stop, I won't finish." He got up, walked over to the sideboard in the living room, and took out a small, dented metal tin. I recognized it instantly. It was the box where he kept important things, the garage contract, old photos, some newspaper clippings. And under all of that, the little silver key that had opened my world when I was a kid. I remembered the first time I saw that key. I was 7, it was raining outside, and the leaks in the garage roof were dripping into plastic buckets. My dad called me over with this conspiratorial smile. "Come here, Emily. I want to show you something." He opened the tin like he was revealing a family secret and held up that key in front of me, hanging from a worn leather keychain. "This is the heart of my first love," he said, and I frowned, confused. "The car, Em. That one out there. One day this is going to be the start of a new story." and you'll be in it. Back then, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I stored the whole scene carefully. The warm yellow light, the rain, the smell of gasoline mixed with coffee, his hand holding the key like something sacred. That day, I learned that some objects carry silent promises. Now, years later, he put that same tin on the middle of the kitchen table like he was repeating an old ritual. "I've made some decisions," he said, opening it slowly. "About the garage, the house, and the car." The word car hovered in the air. My heart sped up. I had the feeling this moment had been being prepared for decades, even if no one ever said it out loud. I thought of all the nights I stayed late at the garage helping with the books, all the Saturdays I spent dealing with grumpy customers, all the "we'll sort that out later, Em" he gave me whenever I brought up the future. I also thought of Daniel, of all the times he just disappeared, failed to answer calls when the hospital phoned, skipped Dad's birthdays, and later justified it with, "Things are busy, you know how it is." Yet there we were, side by side, as if we had walked the same road. My father took the key from the tin. It glinted under the weak kitchen light. He held it for a few moments, staring at it like he could see all the versions of himself through the metal. I watched nostalgia move across his face like a quiet lightning bolt. He blinked fast, swallowing something that had tried to rise. "Today, I'm going to hand this over," he said eventually, "and I want it to be in peace." In that instant, even without understanding fully, I knew this afternoon wasn't just about an old car. It was about everything I'd lived with him, and about everything Daniel hadn't. When my father closed his fist around the key, time seemed to slow down, like even the ticking of the clock had grown wider gaps between each second. I watched him with a kind of painful attention, noticing things I had ignored for years: the slight tremor in his right index finger, the vein that stood out on his neck when he swallowed, the dark spots on the backs of his hands that weren't there when I was little, back when he was giant and I was just someone trying to reach him. He still hadn't said who the car was going to, but the question was already burning inside me. At the same time, I was ashamed for thinking that way. It was just a car, right? A pile of old metal. But I knew it wasn't. It was the symbol of everything we'd lived together. It was the way he taught me how to drive, the way he let me hold the wheel for the first time, the stars I saw through the cracked windshield when we drove home too late from somewhere. It was part of him, part of me, and part of what I still thought would happen between us. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "So, Dad?" he asked, leaning in over the table, elbows planted like he was negotiating a deal. "What did you decide?" The expectation in his posture bothered me. There was something entitled in it, like he'd already positioned himself to receive, as if the years of absence didn't weigh anything in this silent family equation. My father took a deep breath. He's never been one for long speeches. He's a man of short sentences and quiet gestures. When he finally spoke, he didn't try to pretty it up. "I've thought about this a lot," he began. "More than you both imagine. This car..." He glanced out the window toward the garage, as if he could see it parked there. "This car is everything I ever was. It's the beginning of my story. I met your mother because of it. I brought both of you home from the hospital in it. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I also got a lot right in that car." As he talked, a series of images flashed across my mind like frames from an old movie. Me, tiny, asleep in the back seat with my head resting against the glass. Him driving slowly, one hand on the steering wheel, the other reaching back to hold my small hand. The time we got stuck on the road because the engine overheated and we had to sit there looking up at the stars while we waited for it to cool down. The first time I heard him cry, without him knowing I was listening, sitting in the driver's seat with his head against the wheel after my mother left. I grew up in that car. Not physically, but emotionally. It was where the hard conversations happened. It was where he asked me, one day, if I was really okay when he knew I wasn't. It was where I told him about my first boyfriend, my first heartbreak, and the time I almost dropped out of college because I thought I'd never be more than the mechanic's daughter. For Daniel, the memories were fewer and thinner. He always felt trapped in that car, the one who complained that the seats were too stiff, that the radio barely worked, that the smell of grease in the upholstery killed the vibe. He wanted to get away from the car, the garage, the town, and he did. But on that path, he left us behind. I know this car means different things to each of you, Dad went on. That's why it was so hard to decide. I don't want to hurt either of you. I've done that too many times without realizing. He looked at me in a way that said he knew more than he had ever said out loud. He knew all the times I'd been the only one there. Knew about the nights I'd driven him to the hospital when his blood pressure spiked. Knew every bill I'd paid, every "I'll give it back later" that never showed up. I've decided the car is going to Daniel, he said. The words fell onto the table like something heavy. For a second, I thought I had misheard. A ringing filled my ears, like when you step out of a loud room into sudden silence. Daniel flashed a wide, almost automatic smile, like he'd been expecting this all along. Knew you'd make the right choice, Dad, he said, laughing and slapping the table. That car is the face of our family, right? It's the legacy. And well, someone has to carry it forward. I stayed silent because that's what I always do. Swallow first, understand later. This time, though, swallowing felt almost impossible. Part of me wanted to explode, to list every moment that made this feel wrong. Another part repeated the phrases I'd heard my entire life. Don't make a scene. Be understanding. He's your brother. Your father must know what he's doing. Dad kept going, as if he needed to finish before anyone interrupted. The garage, he said, throat already a little rough. The garage goes to you, Emily, at least for now. If you want to sell, rent, shut it down, that's your call. I don't want to chain your life here. I've chained it enough. And that was where the contrast hit hardest. To everyone else, it might have looked like he was balancing things. The car for Daniel, the garage for me. But I knew what it really meant. The car was the symbol, the romantic story, the part people admire and take pictures of. The garage was the work, the sweat, the bills, the responsibility of keeping alive something that had been dying slowly. I loved him too much to say that out loud right then. But inside, something cracked. It was like watching someone give away a piece of me without asking. Of course, Daniel cut in. Since the car represents the family and all that, I think it makes sense we think about everything together, right? Like inheritance, properties, that kind of thing. He laughed, like this was all just a fun conversation. In the end, what's one person's is everyone's. We're family. It was with that sentence, tossed out as a joke, that he started quietly claiming much more than a car. While he talked about legacy and tradition, I remembered every time he had vanished when the legacy was crushing just my shoulders. And then that thought I'd been dodging for years finally pushed through. Maybe I'd spent my whole life just holding everything together so other people could choose the pretty parts of the story. Have you ever felt that? Like you're the backstage of everyone's life, but never the main stage of anything? While that question rolled through me, I looked at my dad. He seemed smaller than ever. There was such tiredness in his eyes that, for a second, I almost understood why he'd made this decision. Maybe, in his mind, he was trying to avoid a fight. Maybe he thought that since I'd always been strong, I could handle one more unfair thing. Maybe he felt guilty for how hard he'd been on Daniel as a teenager and was trying to make up for it now. Parents are human, and humans make mistakes trying to do the right thing. Knowing that didn't make it hurt less. A memory surfaced. The first time I ever felt like something was truly mine. It wasn't the car itself. It was a random late afternoon when I was 16. My dad sat with me on the curb, both of us looking at the car parked under the fading sun. One day, when I'm gone, you'll be the one who knows every bolt in that car, he said, lighting a cigarette he later threw away half-finished. You pay attention to everything. You've always been like that. I believed him. Maybe that's why, when I watched him hand the key to someone else, it felt like he'd quietly ripped out a promise from inside my chest. I could have spoken right there. I could have listed every night we spent shoulder to shoulder trying to keep the garage afloat. I could have reminded him, in front of my brother, that when he had his first panic attack, it was in my arms that he cried. I could have said, "This isn't fair." Instead, I swallowed and clenched my jaw so hard my teeth hurt. But silence, I'd learn later, speaks too. And sometimes, it's exactly what prepares the ground for the one sentence that changes everything. That night, I couldn't go straight home. Instead, I pulled over on some random side street, turned off the engine, and stayed there in the dark. listening to the muffled sounds of the city in the distance. In my head, the scene in the garage played on loop. Dad handing over the key, Daniel holding it like a trophy, and me standing off to the side, trying to make myself smaller than what I felt. I grabbed my phone and opened my messages. The last texts from my dad were still there on the screen. "Come over today at 4. I want you both here. Important." I stared at those words and wondered when important had become synonymous with, "This is going to hurt." I thought about calling someone, but realized I didn't have anyone who fit what I needed. Friends understand a lot, but some wounds carry your last name, and they're hard to explain to people who didn't grow up in the same house, hearing the same phrases, breathing in the same silences. So instead of calling, I started talking to myself, out loud, in the front seat. It's something I'd been doing without noticing, like I needed to hear my own voice to believe what was happening. "Maybe you're overreacting," I said into the empty car. "Maybe it really is just a car. You still have the garage, you have his trust, you always had it. Maybe he gave it to Daniel because he thinks it's the only way to keep him around." I tried to rationalize, tried to wear empathy like a dress that no longer fit, but I kept forcing on because I was afraid to admit I needed something else. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more a certain memory pushed through, stubborn, ripping apart every excuse. It was a winter afternoon. I must have been 14. School had organized some kind of fair, and I needed someone to come see my science project, a silly presentation I'd worked way too hard on. My mom was gone by then. Daniel had made up some excuse. I kept pacing by the school gate, waiting as the courtyard slowly emptied. Just as it was getting dark, the blue car rolled into the parking lot, coughing its way into a spot. Dad jumped out, still in his work jacket, stained with grease. "Sorry I'm late, Em," he said, trying to flatten his hair with his fingers. "A customer came in last minute, and you know how it is?" I did know. But that day, seeing that car stop there felt like watching a promise come true. He'd come. He'd seen me. He'd made the effort. And somehow, the fact that he'd shown up in that car made everything feel more real, more charged with meaning. That car wasn't just transport. It was how he arrived for me. Leaning against my own steering wheel now, I took a shaky breath, trying to calm the chaos in my chest. The contrast between what I felt and what I was chasing became painfully obvious. I wanted recognition, not the kind on paper or in wills, but the kind that tastes like, "I know what you did for me." I wanted my father to say, in front of other people, that he saw the weight I'd carried. Instead, I got the silent role of the one who can handle it, while the symbols went to the one who arrived rarely, but always arrived shining. Funny how we adapt to the roles we're given, until staying in that shape starts to hurt more than change. I'd always been the responsible daughter, the one who calls, who shows up, who does the grocery run, who drives him to appointments, who sits for hours in a hospital waiting room pretending everything is fine. For years, I wore that like a badge of honor. At least I'm the one who's here. But that day, for the first time, it felt like chains. Have you ever caught yourself living a role you never chose, but accepted because it seemed like the only option? When people hear you say, "Don't worry, I've got it," so many times they start to believe you never need anyone to have you. And then when it's time to hand out the symbolic things, the gifts that look like official love, you're automatically left out, precisely because everyone assumes you'll stay anyway. While that thought dug deeper into me, another memory surfaced, this time with Daniel. It was the day of Dad's first serious health scare. I was at work when the neighbor called saying he'd collapsed at the garage. I dropped everything, raced to the hospital, and spent the night in an uncomfortable chair, listening to monitors beep and breathing in that sharp disinfectant smell. I called Daniel over and over. On the third try, he answered, music thumping in the background, laughing. "Em, I'm in the middle of an event. I can't leave now," he said. "You've got this, right? You've got this, right?" That sentence stuck to me like glue, and I did have it. I brought Dad home the next day, helped him shower, sorted his meds, cooked soup. Daniel showed up on the weekend with a store-bought cake, talking loud, filling the room. Dad lit up, and I thought, it's okay. At least he came. I was always finding excuses for him. Now, years later, it was as if that entire night had been erased, as if all the drives to the hospital, The quiet late-night conversations, the sacrifices didn't count when it came time for a symbolic gesture. Still slumped over the wheel, I found myself thinking about the title of this story I'd been unknowingly writing for years, When My Dad Gave His First Car to My Brother. It really was the perfect summary of something way bigger than metal. Because underneath it all, it wasn't about who got what. It was about who had been seen and who hadn't. I also started asking myself what I actually wanted. Did I want the car? Or did I want him to stand there and say, in front of everyone, "I know it was you who stood by me"? Maybe I wanted both. Maybe the car was just the concrete shape of something I'd been quietly asking for. Recognition that went beyond, "You're amazing, Em. I don't know what I'd do without you." There's a huge difference between "I don't know what I'd do without you" and "I choose you." That's when something in me shifted. I realized I'd spent my whole life accepting half-truths, half-presences, half-choices because I didn't want to look ungrateful or dramatic or selfish. But for the first time, the idea of staying quiet felt heavier than the idea of speaking up. And that was when the seed of confrontation took root. Not the screaming, throwing things kind of confrontation. I've always hated that. The kind where you look someone in the eye and calmly say the one sentence no one ever expected to hear from you. In my case, that sentence started forming with 4 simple words. He wasn't even there. Those words started circling in my head like a chorus. He wasn't there when things went bad. He wasn't there when the garage almost went under. He wasn't there when the doctor asked for a decision and no other adult was in the room. He wasn't there when I had to choose between paying the power bill and buying the more expensive medicine. He wasn't there. I was. I stayed. I held it all. For the first time, I thought about saying that out loud, not as an accusation, but as a record. Like someone who, after years holding the house together alone, finally points at the cracks in the wall and says, "Do you see this?" It didn't show up out of nowhere. I drove home that night with that decision still fragile but alive. The next day, I called my dad and told him I wanted to talk, just the two of us. My voice trembled, but at the same time, there was something solid in it, like I was finally planting my feet in my own story. He agreed. We set it for the weekend, at his place. I hung up and sat on my couch, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. I was going to shake a structure that had been standing for decades, full of memories and guilt. But if I didn't do it now, when all these decisions were being made, I knew I'd spend the rest of my life telling this story with a knot in my throat. When Saturday came, the weather matched the inside of me. The sky was clear, bright even, but the wind was sharp and cold, as if the day was reminding me that clarity and discomfort often walk hand in hand. I drove back to the house I grew up in, my hands a little sweaty on the steering wheel, mentally rehearsing what I wanted to say, erasing, rewriting, starting over. My dad was on the porch, sitting in a plastic chair, a mug of coffee balanced on his knee. Seeing him there, in that familiar pose, almost made me turn the car around. Part of me wanted to pretend I'd come just to drop off fresh bread, like I'd done so many times before. I wanted to talk about little things, football, the weather, some random neighbor's dog. But underneath that impulse was a deeper exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of smoothing over what hurts you. He smiled when he saw me. "You're early, Em," he said, heaving himself up with some effort. "Figured you'd stall like you used to with school in the mornings." "I've got less time for stalling these days," I tried to joke. We went inside. The house was too tidy, which, for my dad, was always a sign of nerves. Table cleared, cushions straight, no dishes in the sink. He'd prepared for this without knowing what exactly was coming. We sat in the living room. For a few moments, we listened to the neighbor's TV through the wall, the clock ticking, his chair creaking as he shifted. My heart was pounding in my throat. "So," he started, "the car. I imagined you might want to talk about that." He knew me. That part had always been true. Maybe that's why it hurt so much to feel like he'd forgotten what I thought was obvious. "It's not just the car," I said, looking straight at him. "But the car lit the fuse." He nodded slowly. "Then talk to me." It took me a few seconds to find the right entry point. I didn't want it to sound like a tantrum, but I also didn't want to shrink what I felt. "Dad, you've always said that car was the beginning of everything for you," I started. "That it brought you here, that it's your story, And a lot of my memories with you are wrapped up in that car, too. The conversations, the drives to the hospital, the late rides home. You taught me to drive in it, remember? His eyes softened. I remember. You almost drove us straight into the neighbor's fence. I smiled a little, but kept going. I know, in your head, splitting the car and the garage made sense. But I need you to hear how it looked from my side. It felt like the symbol of your story, the part everyone sees, the nice part, went to Daniel. And the heavy part, the work, the responsibility, stayed with me, like always. He frowned. That's not what I meant, Em. I never wanted you to feel used. But I did. Sometimes I still do, I said, more firmly than I expected. I stayed, Dad. I stayed every time you needed someone. I stayed when Mom left. I stayed when the garage almost went under. I stayed when you passed out in the shop. I stayed when the hospital needed someone to sign papers. I stayed. And Daniel, he mostly didn't. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable, but didn't interrupt. That gave me courage. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve anything, I continued. He's your son. You love him. I get that. But I need to say out loud what we've all avoided. He wasn't there. Not the way you think. Not the way I was. There was a heavy silence after that. I could almost hear the old beams of our family framework creaking. You think I don't know that? He asked finally. You think I don't see who shows up when things fall apart? The question surprised me. Sometimes I think you forget, I whispered. Sometimes it feels like when it's time to do these big symbolic things, you're more afraid of losing Daniel than you are of losing me. His eyes filled, shining in a way I'd rarely seen. I'm scared, he admitted. Scared of losing your brother. I already lost your mom. The husband she wanted, I never managed to be. I didn't want to lose my son, too. When he does show up, even if it's messy, He swallowed hard. I cling. And yeah, maybe I did try to buy his presence with things, with that car, with promises. I thought if I gave him something big, he'd stay, or at least come back now and then. His honesty hit me like a wave. I'd always known him as the strong, stubborn man who got up at 5 and worked until his hands hurt. Seeing him as someone terrified of ending up alone, willing to trade pieces of himself to keep a child near, was almost unbearable. And what about me? I asked, my voice shaking. Aren't you afraid of losing me? He looked genuinely surprised. I always thought you wouldn't leave, he said quietly. You're the steady one, the one who can handle it, the one who understands, the one who holds things together. I almost laughed, bitter. That's exactly it, Dad. You counted on that so much you forgot I have a breaking point too, that I can get tired, that I can wonder why, after everything, the most symbolic part of your story was never even on the table as a possibility for me. He ran his hands down his face like he was trying to wake up. I didn't want to hurt you, Em. God knows I didn't. I know, I said, and I did. But sometimes hurt isn't about what you meant. It's about what you chose. You chose to try to keep Daniel with a big gesture. And without realizing it, you placed me in the role of the one who will always stay no matter what. That's not fair love. That's love with uneven weight. The words surprised even me as they came out. But in that moment, it felt like years of scattered thoughts were finally lining up. So what do you want me to do? He asked honestly. You want the car? You want me to take it back from him? I closed my eyes for a second. It wasn't that simple. This was never about swapping objects. I want you to see, I answered. I want you to acknowledge what I did for you. To admit that when you talk about who's been with you on this journey, it's not fair to dump everyone into the same category. And if that means rethinking decisions, okay. If it doesn't, okay. But I need you, at least once, to look at me and say, I know it was you. He went quiet. Long seconds stretched out. I almost backtracked, almost said, forget it, it doesn't matter, like I'd done so many times before. But I held firm. My throat burned. My eyes stung, but I knew that if I swallowed this, I'd never be able to swallow anything again without tasting betrayal. Finally, he spoke. Emily. He said my name in a way that felt heavier. I know it was you. The sentence came loaded with all the words he'd never managed before. His eyes finally let go of the tears he'd kept under layers of pride and hardness. You're the one who stayed when I fell, he went on, voice shaking. You're the one who took me to the doctor, who fought me when I tried to go back to work too soon. You're the one who learned how to deal with the paperwork because I never wanted to. You're the one who listened to me complain about life, about your mother, repeat stories 1,000 times. You saw the worst of me. And you still stayed. I cried too. We both did, each of us clutching our piece of that truth. The room felt smaller but more honest. Less like a set, more like a home. I'm scared, he repeated, that you'll get tired of me. I'm scared I'll get tired of myself because of you, I answered without filter. Scared I'll become that bitter person who tells the same I got screwed over story forever, but never does anything about it. He watched me quietly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like he was actually seeing me, not just hearing me. I'll talk to Daniel, he said at last. Not just about the car, about all of it. I don't know if I can fix what's already been done, but I can at least make clear what you mean to me. And if we need to rethink anything, we do it together. Together did something inside me. It wasn't a magic fix. Decades of old patterns weren't going to vanish in that living room. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I was holding everything up alone. I walked out of that conversation exhausted, but lighter. I knew the real confrontation with Daniel was still coming. I knew the topics of inheritance, the car, the garage, they'd all resurface. But for the first time, I felt like I was standing inside my own story, not just watching other people's narrative unfold around me. The talk with Daniel happened about a week later, on a cloudy Sunday, in the same house where everything had always happened. My dad insisted we all come together to straighten things out. I knew that meant facing not just my brother, but a version of myself who always let things slide to keep the peace. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, sprawled on the couch, scrolling on his phone with the sound on, no headphones. The kind of small disregard that always annoyed me, but that I'd swallowed in the name of keeping it civil. He looked up when I walked in. "Hey, Em," he said, as if nothing was going on. My dad was in the kitchen making coffee. It all looked so ordinary, but there was a tension in the air that none of us dared to name. After a few minutes of empty talk about traffic, work, the weather, Dad came into the living room with a tray and set the cups on the table. He sat in his usual armchair, took a deep breath, and started. "I called you both here because I messed up something important," he said, straightforward. "Actually, in lots of ways. And I think it's time we talk about it honestly." Daniel frowned. "What's with the drama, Dad?" he asked, laughing a little. "It's just a car." "It's not just a car," I said, before my dad could answer. My voice came out steady, and I surprised myself. Daniel turned to me with a half smirk. "Oh, so that's what this is," he said. "You're upset about the car. I knew the bill would come due eventually. I thought you were being a little too mature about it the other day." The way he said too mature came dripping with sarcasm, like he'd been waiting for me to break the whole time. Dad cut in. "It's not just about the car," he repeated, this time echoing my words. "It's about what it represents, and about what each of you has actually done up to now." Daniel lifted his hands, pretending to surrender. "Okay, let's hear it," he said. "Just don't act like some beat-up old car is worth a full family crisis." I looked at him, feeling that blend of exhaustion and anger that comes when someone deliberately chooses the wrong point. "It's not the car, Daniel," I said. "It's the story it carries. It's the fact that you want the symbol, but you weren't here for most of the story." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Here we go," he muttered. "The perfect daughter speech." "I'm not perfect," I said calmly. "I was just here. And there's a huge difference between being perfect and being present." Dad watched us closely, but stayed quiet. I think in some way he knew this part needed to be handled between us. "You think I wasn't present just because I didn't stay in this town breathing dust in the garage?" Daniel said, crossing his arms. "I had my own plans, Em. Just because I didn't want a life of grease and overdue bills doesn't mean I abandoned you." "It's not about you leaving," I replied. "It's about not showing up when things were falling apart. When Dad collapsed at the garage, who sprinted to the hospital? When the power bill was overdue and we were short because he'd paid for medication, who stayed up late trying to figure it out? When the doctor needed someone to sign important paperwork, who was there?" I took a breath. "I didn't invent that, Daniel. Those are facts." He looked away for a second. A crack. "You always loved playing the hero," he shot back, but the words didn't land as hard as they used to. "No," I said, tired. I just didn't have a choice. Someone had to do it, and I'm done pretending that all that weighs the same for everyone. It doesn't. It never did. And when you stood there in the garage talking about legacy and patrimony like you'd carried half of it on your back, that's when it went too far. Dad turned toward him. She's right about a lot of this, Daniel, he said, voice low but firm. And I've taken way too long to admit it. Daniel stared at him. So you're taking her side now, Dad? This isn't about sides, my father answered. It's about telling the truth. I love you, but I also saw who was here when you weren't. And when I made that decision with the car, I let my fear of losing you shout louder than my desire to be fair. That seemed to sting. Daniel lowered his eyes, for once out of smart remarks. So what do you want? He asked after a moment. For me to apologize? Give the car back? I looked at him, feeling the anger wear down, revealing something more complicated. I want you to stop acting like you have automatic rights to the prettiest part of the story, I said. I want you to remember that inheritance isn't just stuff in a will, it's presence, work, sleepless nights. I want, at the very least, honesty. He was quiet for a while. It was strange seeing my brother, who always had an answer ready, sitting there with nothing to say. He started, then stopped. I've been selfish, okay? He said finally. I liked the idea of having the car. I always thought it was ugly, to be honest, but I liked the story that came with it. I thought I could, turn it into something of mine. I didn't think about it the way you just put it. It wasn't a perfect apology, not some movie monologue, but it was real. And at that point, real was enough. And I don't want to spend my life throwing your failures in your face, I said. But I also won't pretend everything's equal here. It isn't. Dad sighed. What I've been thinking, he said slowly, is that we need to do things differently from here on out. The car stays in your name, Daniel, if that's what you want. I'm not going to play tug of war with keys, but I don't want anyone imagining it represents just your part in this. From now on, I need you to understand it wasn't a prize. It wasn't a crown. It was a scared father trying not to lose a son. And I'm not going to let that act become your excuse to put yourself above your sister when we talk about what was built here. Daniel took that in, shoulders slumping a bit. So what then? He asked quietly. What do we do now? The garage is a different conversation, my dad said. It's not going to be a weight dumped on Emily alone anymore. I'm talking to an accountant, figuring out what it's actually worth, and we're going to decide what to do together. That means if you want to say, you show up for more than opinions. Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it again. For the first time, I watched him actually confront the idea that inheritance might mean work too, not just getting the symbolic shiny part. And one more thing, Dad added. Any decisions about selling the house, land, anything like that are only going to happen if you both agree. I'm done with big gestures for one and hoping the other just swallows it. For me, that was a turning point. Not because it magically fixed everything, but because for the first time, my father was talking about balance instead of fear. He wasn't trying to buy Daniel's presence anymore or counting on mine as a given. He was finally putting responsibility on the table beside all the blessings. The conversation went on, full of back and forths, awkward jokes, half-hearted apologies. It didn't become a perfect reconciliation scene. We didn't leave holding hands and swearing never to fight again. But something important shifted. We dropped the fantasy. And when fantasy drops away, the truth, however messy, finally has room to breathe. That night, driving home, I felt oddly calm. The car was still his. The garage was still an open question. My dad was still a man trying to do better after a lifetime of fumbling through. My brother was still someone swinging between selfishness and fragility. None of that had changed overnight. But I had. I was no longer willing to tell this story as the quiet daughter who takes everything and says nothing. For the first time, I'd said, out loud and in front of the people who needed to hear it, he wasn't there. And instead of blowing the family apart, it had, in its own clumsy way, started rearranging where we all stood. That's when I realized this was never really a story about a car. It was about learning to step out from backstage and finally stand where I belonged. In the center of my own life. Time has this strange habit of moving forward even when it feels like something inside you has stopped. The months after that were a mix of practical adjustments and emotional rearrangements. That Sunday conversation didn't fix everything, but it opened doors that had been locked for years. My dad, like he'd promised, started cleaning up the garage's mess. He called in an accountant, gathered boxes of old receipts and contracts, and tried to pull decades of chaos into some kind of order. Watching him squint at spreadsheets and email printouts was oddly tender. Every now and then he'd call me over. Does this make any sense to you? He'd ask, holding out a paper. I don't want to dump all this weight on you anymore, okay? Daniel started showing up more often too. Not enough to look like a total transformation, but enough that you could tell something had shifted. He began coming by on Saturdays, walking around the garage like it was foreign territory. What's this thing called again? He'd ask, pointing at a wrench. Dad would shake his head and chuckle. This is the basics, kid. How are you going to carry legacy if you don't even know what the tools are called? There was a soft irony in those moments that hadn't been there before. By letting go of the fantasy, we had somehow made space for a bit of humor. I kept splitting my time between my office job and the garage. But now there was a crucial difference. I no longer saw myself as the only one keeping everything afloat. I was helping to reorganize something big, tiring, and full of holes. But this time with the understanding that if I ever decided to walk away, that choice would be part of the conversation, not treated like betrayal. At some point during that season, Dad had another health scare. Nothing as serious as before, but serious enough to land him in the ER again. The difference this time was who showed up. I was there, of course. But a couple of hours later, Daniel walked into the hospital. No excuses, no delays. I watched him come into the waiting room genuinely worried, and it caught me off guard. He sat next to me, quiet at first. Is he okay? He asked. He's stable, I said, but he's going to have to take it seriously now, really slow down. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, nervous. You know, he said, I always thought this day would never come. Dad always seemed unbreakable, you know? Seeing him like this? I know, I said softly. I thought he was eternal too, in his stubborn way. We sat there listening to the muted TV, sharing the same fear from two different lives. It wasn't a warm, fuzzy moment, but it was real. I've been a jerk, haven't I? He asked eventually, still looking straight ahead. We both have, I said, deliberately including myself. Some people just have more practice. He gave a crooked smile at that. I kept trying to make up for my absence with stories, he admitted. Talking about projects, ideas, plans I never actually followed through on. When Dad handed me that key, I thought, finally, I've got a clear role in all this. I ran off to build a narrative around it that worked for me, without thinking about what it already meant to you. I know, I answered, and I'm not asking you to hand the key back. But maybe what we're building now matters more than any old title or symbol. He nodded. It was weird, but for the first time, the phrase, we're siblings, felt like it had a small chance of someday matching reality. Time moved. The garage started looking a little less chaotic, not modern, but less desperate. Dad slowed down for real, grudgingly accepting that he couldn't carry an engine block like he used to. One afternoon, as we were folding up empty boxes, he turned to me and said, I've been thinking. The way I handled that car, the way I split things up. He exhaled. I'm not going to undo what's been done, but I want to change what comes next. I want that car to be yours and Daniel's. Dad, it doesn't work like that, I said automatically. You can't cut a car in half. He laughed. I know. I'm not talking about splitting metal. I'm talking about what it stands for. He looked at me. One day, maybe, you two decide together what happens to it. Maybe you sell it, maybe you restore it, maybe you let it sit and rust. But I don't want it to be a source of resentment anymore. If that car was the start of my story, then maybe the last part of it is watching you two, even if it's awkward, share both the weight and the worth of what it meant to me. I didn't have any neat answer, but the phrase, share the weight and the worth, stuck. Deep down, that was all I'd ever wanted, for people to stop acting like value and burden live in separate accounts. Sometime later, on a gray afternoon, much like the one when all this started, the three of us went to the garage together. Dad moved slower. Daniel looked more awake. I was less angry, more tired, and somehow freer. "Let's turn the old thing on," Dad said, running his hand along the hood. Just to hear him one more time. Daniel took the key out of his pocket. This time, though, before heading straight for the driver's seat, he stopped, turned to me, and held it out. "Want to start it today?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but it hit me like a wave. In that small gesture, I saw something shift. Not some grand apology, but a quiet acknowledgement that I also belonged in that story. I took the key. It was cold in my hand, but inside I felt an odd warmth made of memory, pain, and something beginning to look like healing. I sat in the driver's seat, breathed in the familiar smell, placed my hands on the wheel. For a moment, I was 16 again, trying not to hit the neighbor's fence while Dad held the parking brake tight. I turned the key. The engine coughed, complained a little, then came to life. The sound filled the garage like always. But for the first time, it didn't sound like a reminder of something stolen from me. It sounded like a witness to something we were slowly rebuilding. In the rearview mirror, I saw my dad smiling, tired but real. Daniel was leaning against the bay door, watching quietly without any jokes. And right there I realized the ending of this story wasn't going to be about perfect justice or mathematically fair inheritance. It would come in a softer form, an imperfect human agreement that, from now on, no one would pretend to have been where they hadn't. We parked the car back in its spot as the sun began to go down, painting everything in that bittersweet golden light. Dad touched the hood one last time. "At the end of the day," he said, "the most important thing this car gave me was you two. The rest is just metal." And for the first time, I believed he truly saw it that way. When I tell this story now, it's not to settle who deserved what, or to crown one of us the hero and the other the villain. It's to remember that for a long time, I swallowed the truth that my brother wasn't there, and that the day I finally said those words out loud, I didn't destroy my family. I started rebuilding the place I occupy inside it. If you've listened this far, and you recognize yourself as the one who always stays, always holds everything up, always understands, maybe this story can be a reminder that your presence has value even when no one puts a key in your hand. And if, at some point, someone took credit for something you helped build, you are not being dramatic for wanting the truth told. It's your life. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story reminded you of someone or of a part of you that's always stood in the background, tell me in the comments. I really do want to hear the other side. Sometimes it's only when we share the weight that it finally starts to feel lighter.